Hey everyone, thanks for coming back. In this Artemis news video, I'll talk about some updates we got from NASA about Gateway assembly progress, a hint about when Artemis II stacking might get started, and provide some context to the latest discussion about when Artemis III might fly and whether it will still be a lunar landing by that time. One quick follow-up from the previous news video, I heard back from NASA Public Affairs at Kennedy Space Center about the cryogenic propellant loading test at Pad 39B with the fueling systems there and Mobile Launcher 1. They confirmed that exploration ground systems used the old liquid hydrogen sphere for the test to flow LH2 from that original storage sphere to the ML. Plumbing that connects the old sphere and the new, larger sphere will be tested later, possibly after the mobile launcher has rolled back to the vehicle assembly building. We finally got an update from the NASA Gateway program this past week. I stitched together the responses in a story that was published on nasaspaceflight.com on Thursday, May 23rd. My original request to interview someone from the Gateway program about 6 weeks ago got an immediate counteroffer to respond via email, which was disappointing but also revealing. As I've noted, NASA is less accessible today, so this isn't surprising. After submitting an outline of questions back in early April, we got back responses from NASA and ESA, the European Space Agency, this past week. I was looking for more detail about the status of assembly and test of the different Gateway elements and the programmatic status of the initial Gateway capability, the first two modules that will be launched together. The power and propulsion element, the PPE, and the HALO, the habitation and logistics module. Those will be needed for Artemis IV, along with the first Gateway logistics mission that will debut the SpaceX Dragon XL spacecraft. The solar electric propulsion system thrusters were one of the watch items that the Government Accounting Office had highlighted over the past few years. The update noted that the two sets of SEP thrusters are going through qualification testing that is hoped will be completed by the end of this year, and then the flight units would start to be delivered for installation on the PPE spacecraft next year in 2025. NASA noted that the propellant tanks for the more conventional bipropellant thrusters and the SEP thrusters have already been delivered to prime contractor Maxar, and installation of the hypergolic and xenon propellant tanks was scheduled to begin this month, May 2024. The critical design review for PPE was also held in March. On the HALO module, welding of the structure in Italy was completed last year, and it is going through some structural testing before it is scheduled to ship to Arizona in the second half of this year for outfitting of components, also called the integration phase of assembly. The HALO CDR was completed last year in June 2023. PPE and HALO are launching together as a co-manifested vehicle on an expendable Falcon Heavy, and the integrated CDR for the spacecraft is also planned for some time in the second half of this year. A new target launch date is still to be announced, but it was noted in the response from PAO that the President's fiscal year 2025 budget request projected it sometime in fiscal year 2026, which ends in September of 2026. That budget request also published the agency baseline commitment that I've gone over more than once, which more conservatively projects a launch date of December 2027. So overall, it sounds like the SEP systems are making progress towards delivery of the flight units for installation onto the PPE. We'll have to see how things look next year for that and when HALO is shipped here to the States for integration. And also look for a more specific target launch date from NASA at some point. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson testified to the CJS subcommittee of the full Senate Appropriations Committee about that budget request for the upcoming fiscal year on Thursday, May 23rd. CJS stands for Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies, and the hearing reviewed the budget request for NASA and the National Science Foundation, which is a different NSF than the one that I work with on occasion. Anyway, there was a little news from former Senator Nelson's testimony, mostly focused on Artemis III, which I'll come back to in a little bit. First, with respect to Artemis II preparations and those watch items that I've mentioned frequently, Nelson provided a little extra detail about when Exploration Ground Systems might start stacking SLS for the mission.
Vehicle assembly building. This next Artemis II that will go next year will start to be stacked this summer. The solid rockets first, And then the core stage that's made in Louisiana will be done this fall.
So that's a general target and narrows those milestones down a little bit to a 3-month period, with the start of SLS booster stacking by mid to late September and the mate of the core stage to the boosters between then and mid to late December. That fits with the most recent target for delivery of the core stage, which was no earlier than the summer. By the time that the core is mated to the boosters, EGS will need to have the LVSA, the Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, on hand at Kennedy Space Center, so the agency's Pegasus barge will need to make a trip up to Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama to pick that up by whenever in the fall that core stage mate is planned. With respect to Artemis III, here's the question from Senator Moran, who is the senior senator from Kansas, and former Senator Nelson's response.
Senator Nelson, let me remind you of your days of being a United States Senator. The clock only gives me 5 minutes. Let me add to the Artemis conversation. The budget request indicates that there will be a further delay in the launch dates on Artemis II, slipping to September 25 and Artemis III launching no earlier than September 26. How confident are you in those dates for Artemis II and III and subsequent missions?
First of all, we don't fly until it's ready because of the safety of our astronauts. We think that September of 25 for Artemis II is a realistic date. Obviously, September of 26 for Artemis III, which, as you think about it, and I want this in the record, Artemis III, if you compare it to the Apollo, and so it is a difficult task, and if we land, it is dependent on SpaceX having their lander ready. And in a couple of weeks, they're going to launch that huge rocket that has 33 Raptor engines in its tail, and they're going to do more showing the space worthiness of it. It is my hope that SpaceX will be ready with their lander.
Thank you.
There was some wondering about the use of the word if when he said, quote, if we land, but on the same date, Mike Serafin, who is the Artemis III mission manager, was less subtle than that. And he was basically repeating something that we've heard before, which is that NASA is considering its options for Artemis III, or whatever the mission after Artemis II might be. NASA leadership started talking about this about a year ago, and it is one of the reasons why it is a recurring theme. Artemis is NASA's top priority. The President and Congress agree on this. For that and other reasons, there's a lot of interest in the top priority of that top priority, which is the first crewed lunar landing on Artemis III, obviously accomplishing that both safely and successfully. When that happens comes up a lot, and since this time it came up in the news, what I'll go over here is a recap of some key points. First, all the Moon to Mars programs will be challenged to make the current target date of September 2026, even if Starship development is probably the critical path. Starship has the biggest ambitions for being ready for Artemis III, but SLS has production challenges, and we're seeing some lingering issues from Artemis I, like the development challenge with the Orion base heat shield. Although Starship might be the long pole, a long-term goal for the agency was to demonstrate the annual cadence that they one day hope will be the norm. Catherine Kerner, the head of the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, noted in the recent NASA Advisory Council meeting at the end of April that the Artemis III target date was aligned with Artemis II.
As we incorporated our lessons learned from Artemis I, and as we were experiencing some of the challenging development activities preparing for both Artemis II and Artemis III, it became evident that we need to give the team some more time to prepare for Artemis II. So we moved Artemis II. And the Artemis III date was set 1 year after Artemis II. The development for that hardware, I'll talk a little bit about later.
NASA has talked about the desire to fly Artemis III a year after Artemis II before. This is what Kerner's predecessor, Jim Free, said in March of 2023.
Our next question is from Lucy Arborg of AFP.
Hi, thanks for doing this. Question for Jim. If Artemis II is planned for November 2024, what can you tell us regarding the timeline for the Artemis III launch? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. We have always planned for roughly about 12 months between those missions. That's still what we're planning to. We've always characterized it as, that is another mission that adds to the complexity. Our plan has always been 12 months, but there are significant developments that have to occur, and that's just the nature of trying to land people on the moon. So we're still sticking with that 12 months, but we're always looking at the development of all the hardware that has to come together for that.
One of the inferences from the desire to fly again 12 months after Artemis II is if that mission were to slide from the current September 2025 target to October 2025, for example, then the no earlier than target date for Artemis III would also slide with it to October 2026. Starship development is the biggest schedule wildcard right now, but the timing of Artemis III also depends on when Orion and SLS are ready, and that depends in part on what is learned during Artemis II. Production milestones for the Orion and SLS flight hardware for Artemis III are also watch items. So given where things are right now, it's more likely that Orion and SLS could be ready to fly in, say, 2027 with the least number of caveats. But that's just the way it looks right now. The second point is that the obvious alternative to a lunar landing is also delayed, that being the Gateway. The most recent NASA target launch date was around October 2025, and the formal agency baseline commitment is December 2027, which defines a 2-year date range. We just got a little status update, but we can't see an integrated master schedule or any of the trends in those dates, so if we split the difference, it's purely speculative. But if we do that, we get a launch date of the Gateway co-manifested vehicle basically at the end of 2026. That would be too late to support an Artemis mission in the late 2026 or 2027 timeframe because of that 1-year-long transit that Gateway must take to get from the Earth to the Moon. That doesn't preclude waiting, of course, but the what-if option that Eric Berger wrote about in his story for Ars Technica a month ago was talking about a pretty wild idea. That idea was to fly an Earth orbit docking mission after Artemis II using an SLS without a second stage, just the core stage and boosters. If NASA was seriously considering that as an option, it would be because they prioritize reducing the gaps between flights. But that option would not be free and would require extra analysis work from Orion and SLS, and probably exploration ground systems to figure out how to handle the special equipment necessary. That extra analysis work itself might take time and could push a possible launch date into 2027 or later, especially if NASA delays making a decision for a while or delays it as long as possible. Another consideration is that if NASA really wants to fly a mission a year after Artemis II, they would need to announce a flight crew for that mission well before Artemis II flies. The Artemis II crew started training for the mission in the middle of 2023, in June of last year. At that time, the launch was planned for the end of this year, so training began at about launch minus 18 months. Working backwards from September 2026, that would put crew training and other planning milestones like the mission integration review, which is also planned for L-18 months, in the March 2025 timeframe, less than a year from now. If NASA wanted to wait until after Artemis II to finalize the next mission and name a crew, then they would need to agree internally to a significantly shorter amount of planning and preparation time in order to fly that mission 12 months after Artemis II returns. On Friday, May 24th, SpaceX started publishing materials ahead of its 4th Starship flight test, noting that they learned a lot from the 3rd flight test on March 14th. The 4th test flight could happen as soon as June 5th, and the materials also said that the focus of the next test flight would narrow to reusability of the system. There will be no attempt to restart the Starship engines once the ship is inserted into its nearly orbital trajectory. Demonstrating that the engines can carry out a deorbit burn-style firing after restarting on orbit is a prerequisite to Starship going orbital. It's understandable that reusability is the highest priority, given that it is fundamental to the objectives of the system. But it could be another sign that progress on the capabilities needed by NASA for an Artemis III lunar landing will remain slow this year. Artemis III relies on the on-orbit Starship capabilities, and those will build on launching and reusing the flight hardware. For now, demonstrating those on-orbit capabilities and their reliability are on hold. It's not clear if the first attempt to insert Starship into a stable orbit will be on the 5th test flight or another one farther in the future, which is probably one of the reasons that NASA continues to conduct these what-if exercises about what Artemis mission they could fly in the 2027 timeframe if Starship isn't ready to go to the moon by then. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. We're about a month away from the summer here in the US, and that's when we might start to see the next Artemis II hardware milestones. If NASA goes ahead and starts stacking the boosters for Artemis II in the summer for a September 2025 launch, that generic 12-month SRB stack life clock could come into play again next summer. The when Artemis III question also isn't going away. This next Starship test flight won't directly address Artemis capabilities, but it will provide the next checkpoint on the big picture schedule.